Hello,
Hi,
Bernhard.
Carsten.
Bernhard,
Hello,
what are we
everyone.
doing here?
Yeah, so this is our fourth session on Azure Stack HCI. This one is about Azure Virtual Desktop, as this is now released on Azure Stack HCI. And maybe we should introduce ourselves a little bit before we start into the session, right? So, who are
Good
you?
idea.
What are you doing?
I'm the older one, so I start, of course. So my name is Carsten Rachfahl. I'm a Microsoft MVP for cloud and data center management and also Azure. So I'm a hybrid MVP. I do on-premise and I do Azure. And what is better than this product, Azure Stack HCI? So it's a hybrid, true hybrid product. But Bernhard, before we go into
Yeah.
depth here, what are you doing?
Well, I work for Microsoft, so quite some time now. I've always been in technical roles, and this is, sort of combining both worlds, like the on-premise world and the hybrid world or the Azure world together. Yes, and I'm working in the Microsoft Azure in the FastTrack team for Azure, and we help customers to fast forward on Azure. And my specialty is Azure Stack HCI and Azure Virtual Desktop. Okay. Okay, so the first session we are going to do will be sort of, bear with us, a little bit boring maybe because it is slide work, right? But I think it's an important one, especially for the people that are new to Azure Stack HCI or that are new to Azure Virtual Desktop. Okay, so let's give you, or we want to give you, an overview and talk about some of the basics of Azure Virtual Desktop. So, but for the folks that are coming from the previous version, right, or which have tried Azure Stack HCI 22H2, or have tested Azure Virtual Desktop on this previous release of Azure Stack HCI, this is for you, right? For the ones that are new, skip this one, go to the next slide, and fast forward on the video. Okay, but for the folks that are coming from the previous version, you should know that Azure Stack HCI 23H2 is or was released on February 2024. And with that, the deployment has changed quite dramatically, which is when you were coming from previously, you had a set of PowerShell scripts maybe, or you did use some on-premise tooling like Windows Admin Center for installing Azure Stack HCI. This is no longer the case. You're now going and do that all from your Azure portal, from your Azure subscription, right? So this is completely different now. And we'll probably owe you a session on this, right, Carsten? So you may
maybe.
need to.
Let's see.
However, with this new release, Azure Virtual Desktop was released as well on the same date, basically. So AVD on HCI was always in preview before. You could try it out, but it was not officially supported by us, right? And there's another thing which Azure Virtual Desktop relies on, which is the Azure Resource Bridge, or the ARC-enabled virtual machines, as you would find it on our public documentation, right? This is basically the technology that allows you to create virtual machines on HCI using the Azure portal, right? So it's like the Azure portal is like a remote control to create virtual machines on your HCI. However, this is required in a VDI environment, right? Because you want to create your session hosts, and maybe not only one of them, but many, and some automation, as you have in Azure using ARM templates, for example, is pretty useful there. Okay. However, doing it manually would still be possible, but you would lose some functionality. But we talk you about the details a little bit. Okay, so this is the level setting. 23H2 is the OS that we are working on, and AVD is now ready for prime time.
Yeah, Bernhard, maybe one addition. As far as I know, AVD on 22H2 is not supported anymore and is not, I think, not working correctly anymore, right? The resource bridge, there was a kind of resource bridge. It's also not supported anymore, or it was never supported, but it's not working anymore. So you have to go to 23H2.
And that may change over the time as well, right? So because some things will be switched off. I mean, you could get it working somehow, but not the full experience. So don't do it. Just don't do it. Use the latest bits, right? When you try this out. Okay. Okay. Yes, and that's maybe a little bit, because we did a series for AVD on 22H2. So, if you wonder why this old series is out there, we may take it offline. We may, sort of archive it for historical reasons. But, this is the series you should watch if you go for AVD on HCI. Okay.
Yeah. So far,
So
you
far.
never know what's happened in the future. It's Azure is a little bit fluid, so also AVD is a little bit fluid, right? It's never a static thing.
Yes.
So let's talk about the hardware. Maybe I do that because most of the other slides you will talk about. This is the hardware. If you watched one of our other series, we always use this hardware. It's hardware from a German vendor, Thomas Krenn. It's Azure Stack HCI certified. We have 4 nodes. They are AMD based, so it's not an Intel based setup. It's an AMD based setup. Every node has a 116 core AMD Ryzen 7313. I put it that way. They have 0.5 terabyte of RAM and 6 NVMe's, smaller NVMe's. This is a demo setup, but we have plenty of space. And in addition, here we have a hardware GPU, a server GPU from NVIDIA, an A2 GPU in the systems. That's not required by AVD, but it helps a lot. For example, if you have workloads running in your AVD session hosts that require, for example, graphic, there are some tools there. I remember, I think Photoshop has a requirement on GPUs and so on. That's helpful. And we will also talk about a new feature in Azure Stack HCI that's called GPU partitioning, or also GPU DDA. We will talk about that and how we can use GPUs in our AVD virtual machines. But I think that's enough for the hardware. And let's talk about some basics about Azure Stack HCI, right?
Right. So this is a refresher. We don't go into the full details here because there are other series that we did, right? But remember, right, if you're new to Azure Stack HCI and if you're new to Azure Virtual Desktop, so this is the HCI introduction slide, sort of, right? So we do have validated hardware. Let's put it like this, right? In different qualities that you can buy. That means we work with the OEMs and make sure that this hardware is validated to be a valid system for Azure Stack HCI, right? Because there are some requirements, especially on the hypervisor, but also on the storage level. And as we do have a hyper-converged setup, we also rely heavily on the network itself, and making sure that this all works smoothly together. There is the validated hardware that we have. On top of it, we install the operating system, the Azure Stack HCI operating system, which you download from the Azure portal, and you put it on your nodes, and then you sort of marry your nodes together with Azure. So you register those with Azure, and then you launch finally the full installation for the Azure Stack HCI cluster, right, from the cloud. Once you have done that, you can run workload on top of it. And that's either virtual machine based or it's based on a Kubernetes system. So meaning running in containers. But the workload that we are going to deploy here is Azure Virtual Desktop. So that would mean we have virtual machines with a Windows client operating system running on top of our Azure Stack HCI system. And these are not isolated, right? So these need to be hooked up to Azure. And we need some Azure services to talk to. One of them, for example, is very important. We need the Entra ID for users to authenticate to Azure in order to make sure that these ones are allowed to actually grab a desktop and log on to the desktop. right? But there are also other components that we need. For example, on the right-hand side, you see the Azure Services integration using Arc. This is an agent that runs inside of every desktop and connects this desktop up to Azure for the purposes, for example, right? So you could use, for example, Azure policies to make sure that the password strength is enough on these nodes, right? And that's basically the idea for AVD, but that's also sort of like a little bit of a role model for other services that you can put on top of HCI. Okay.
Bernhard, maybe I can add something here. I know we talk about this later in the slides, but important is Azure Virtual Desktop is a hybrid solution. Part of it are running in Azure. So we need Azure for the management plane and also for authentication and so on. But the desktop machines are running in our side on our Azure Stack HCI system. So when we do it here, I will connect directly to the hardware that is here on site. You will connect through Azure, but also on the hardware that is here on site. So that's important. The Azure Virtual Desktops in this example are not running in Azure. That's also a possibility with AVD.
Right.
We come from this scenario, but now we can extend AVD to with machines on premise, purely on premise, or also mixed environment where you have some in Azure and some on premises, right?
Yep.
So a customer has to have connectivity to Azure. It's not a pure on-prem solution. It's a hybrid solution.
Yes,
I think
as the
that's
full.
important.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if you intend to use Azure Stack HCI completely isolated, no network cable to the internet, then this would not work for you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we need a connection to Azure, and that especially that needs to be persistent for the Azure Virtual Desktop scenario, right? Because a user, you could try to log in to grab his desktop at any time, possibly, right? Hence, you need connectivity every time. Okay, so we came from Azure Stack HCI. Now let's look a little bit at Azure Virtual Desktop, how that fits together with Azure Stack HCI, right? And AVD, as we sort of, shorten it down to 3 letters, was originally a cloud-only service, right? So everything was served out from Azure, right? So that means you were using the Azure data centers for hosting your desktops, basically, right? So the storage which is attached to virtual machines, the compute, the hypervisors, and the networking that is taken care of by the Microsoft operations folks, right? But now the idea with Azure Stack HCI is to bring it on premise to your location. And we talk a little bit about the reasons why you may be wanting to do that, and host that stuff on your hardware, right? As you've shown in the previous slide, on these 4 nodes, for example, that we have. But still, we require an Azure subscription for controlling that, right? And that also applies not only for Azure Virtual Desktop, but also for the cluster itself, logically, right? And the Azure other services like Azure policies that we may want to put on top of this. Okay. But there are other services that are managed by Microsoft that you are using in that kind of environment. And that's independent of whether you want to use AVD on Azure or on HCI. It's, the top services, the brokering, the web access, the gateways, the load balancers. It's the same platform for both ends, right? And you will be using those. You don't need to install them, right? They will be taken care of by the Microsoft people. But this is part of the solution that is, sort of relieved by you, so you don't have to install all these classic terminal server roles. That's been taken care of by Microsoft.
Bernhard, can I add something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we will talk later about costs because
Yeah.
we have some costs here. But please remember, there are some services that is Microsoft providing that are not running on your hardware,
Hmm.
that influence also the costs a bit. So we have to have that in mind. If we have AVD in Azure, you
Hmm.
have virtual machines you pay for. So there is a price for the virtual machines that run in Azure for the
Hmm.
resources and so on. If we run our AVD session host on-prem, there's not the price for the data center resources because it's running in our data
Hmm.
center. You have some nice cost calculations for AVD.
Hmm.
So we will talk about that. But please remember the blue box
Hmm.
over there. There are some resources involved we need in Azure, and there's a price for
Hmm.
that. Okay.
Okay. So next slide will be also a little bit trying to abstract, what we have heard and make, try to display it a little bit, what runs now in Azure, what is on-prem when it comes to the services itself, right? So we do have our Azure subscription in Azure logically, and what we needed to do is to set up an Active Directory synchronization, right? So the
Mhm.
user's account that you have in your PowerCourse.net Active Directory will be synced to our Entra ID that is tied to the Azure subscription that we are working with, right?
Yeah, at
So
least
that has.
the users that should log on to the virtual
Right,
machines. We don't have to sync the whole Active Directory,
right.
but the users that we use
Mhm.
on the AVD machines, they have to be synced to Entra ID.
Yes,
Right?
yes, yeah, and that makes sense, right? So you restricted some organizational unit where you wanted to say, well, this organizational unit should be synchronized.
Yeah.
Okay, then we have our two clusters, or we intend to simulate like two data center presences, right? So we are not using a big 4-node cluster. We are using two 2-node clusters, right, for simulating this. Okay. Then on the right-hand side in our Azure subscription, we do all the Azure Virtual Desktop objects that we require for setting up Azure Virtual Desktop. We'll talk a little bit about the details, what each icon or what each service or object is doing in the next slide or in this video. But make sure that you understand that there are services or resources that live in your Azure subscription for defining the solution, just as you would do normal Azure Virtual Desktop, um, pure in Azure, right? So it's the same concept. But on the other side, the only difference is now our session hosts, meaning our desktops, they live on premise and run on top of our clusters that we have, right? And the user that would live, would hook up his connecting device, for example. That could be a mobile phone, that could be a mobile, a notepad, a notebook, for example, hooking up to his virtual desktop, connecting through the internet, would reach out to Azure first and then be hooked up to the session host itself. Okay, so maybe let's play through a little bit through how the connection would work, right? And that's sort of independent of if the system is running on premise like Azure Virtual Desktop on HCI as we have now, or as it is in Azure. The principle is the same, right? So on the left hand side we do have the clients. In the middle is the Microsoft managed uh, connection pane, the services, right, that are providing the services. On the right hand side is everything, your not everything, but is your system that you control, like your Entra ID and the desktops that are running on your Azure Stack HCI system, right? So that's the stuff that you control, right?
Yeah. But it's not Entra ID, it's the Active Directory we need here.
Yes, but yes, but the logo, which is we still need the Entra ID. But let's
Yeah.
make sure that point number 0 is when the desktop on your HCI starts up, the AVD agents installed on these, reach out to Azure and tell, hey, dear broker, I'm online, I can take users, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that the host pool, or that we from Microsoft know, hey, these desktops are online and we can serve them with users, right? Then you have the user on the left-hand side, which uses whatever device they want, right, in order to connect to their desktop. And the first thing that they need to do is they need to authenticate against Entra ID, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they basically do the logon or the authentication and authorization against Azure, right? It's your Entra ID. It's not a, but it's the Azure Active Directory, or as it was called previously.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
So that's
once that
this
works,
small blue thing in there. I
right,
haven't seen it
right.
before when you talked
Yeah,
about
yeah,
Entra
yeah,
ID.
yeah. Okay,
Okay, that was my fault. Okay.
okay.
So you
So
connect
when
to Entra ID.
Right. So when we got back the token for hey, you are valid, we go back to the web access or to the broker and determine the resources that are available for that user. Right. The user can then select the resource and connect to the gateway basically. And what then happens is that the gateway or the gateway tells through the brokering service the desktops, hey, you should reach out to me because I have a user waiting here, right? So it's not like that it is an inbound connection from the desktop's perspective. No, it's an outbound connection, right? So in this kind of setup, you don't need to publish the desktop using a public IP address or some sort of reverse proxying for publishing these desktops, right? No, it's an outbound connection, right? And that
And
makes it a
magic
little
is
bit
done by
easier.
Arc, right, Bernhard?
No, no, that's the usual principle, with Azure Virtual Desktop. So that's
Okay.
the AVD agents. That is exactly the same as it is in Azure right now. This connection flow. It's just that the desktops are sitting on a different hypervisor, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's basically it, right? But as you could tell, right, not publishing public IP addresses is good because your brute force attacks are not on you; they are on us, right? Because we would need to deal on the middle tier on the management pane with everyone maybe trying to get into the system, but
Yeah.
not you, right? Which is a good thing. Okay. I hopefully this was sort of clear and I didn't overcomplicate it. But that's
No,
basically the
I
principle.
think it's
Right.
fine. Yeah.
So when would you use Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI? The reasons are basically, either you have data sovereignty stuff. That means you can't go to Azure because law or some regulation prevents you from doing this. Then you would need to stay on premise, for example. Or the other thing is you have latency reasons. That means you don't have a big connection to Azure, or you're so far away from Azure that just wouldn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And don't think only from the application or from the desktop's perspective, because what do you put on these desktops? Most of the times you put applications on the desktops, right? And you might be able to put the desktop in the cloud or into Azure, but not the backend, meaning the SQL server or whatnot, right? And what would not be an ideal scenario, which means don't have a VPN connection between those two systems and have a lot of database calls going back and forward. That would not be the ideal setup for the user. So it might be more optimized from the perception or from the experience that the users has if the desktops are close to the database or to the backend, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that might require you to stay on premise. What do you get then else with that? Well,
Mm.
yep. Do
Yeah,
you want to say?
these are valid reasons, of course,
Mhm.
but maybe customers have also other reasons
Right.
why, for example, GPUs. They want to use
Yeah.
GPUs. We have sometimes problems to get GPUs in Azure because everybody wants GPUs nowadays.
Hmm.
And yeah, here you have it there, right? Okay.
Yep.
Um, costs maybe also something. maybe you have all the stuff
Yeah.
already on premises, and if you move everything to Azure to have a direct connection from an Azure AVD
Mhm.
host to an Azure SQL instance,
Mhm.
maybe that's also a reason. So
Mhm.
these are the obvious reasons are, of course, data sovereignty
Mhm.
and latency, but maybe
Right.
customers have other things in mind too,
Yeah,
right?
and
And you have the
some of the
choice here.
yeah,
Yeah,
some of the benefits here. I mean, it's AVD still, right? So
yeah,
and you don't. We are not saying like you have to decide between one or the other, right? It can be a combination of
yeah.
both, but you still have the same management pane, right? It's all
Mhm.
managed through Azure, which I think makes it easier.
Yeah.
It's just the run environment for the virtual machines is different, but the rest is still the same. Like you're also using the brokers, the gateways. You don't need to manage the terminal server farm, if you will, right? It's just you need to manage the hypervisors, but not the terminal server farm.
Mhm.
Um,
True.
or it also can be in some point more efficient, maybe, right? Because you may have just bought a big SAN for storing user profile data, right? And that might be usable in that kind of environment, right? Where you can provide the user a big space where they can put on their project data, right? So maybe you have a project team that needs to work together. Everyone gets his desktop, but the profile or the project's data is on a big share that all can
Mhm.
access, for example. And you have a little bit more flexibility here, right?
Yeah.
And then you still have the possibility to use a client-based operating system, Windows 11 multi-session, um, and provide that to many users at the same time in one desktop. Multiple users can log on to one single desktop, which is, from a cost perspective, even optimized.
Yeah, that's really a
Mhm.
big thing with
Mhm.
Azure Virtual Desktop, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because you can't get a multi-session desktop
Right.
anywhere else except in Azure with
Right.
AVD
Right.
and on Azure Stack HCI with
Right.
AVD.
It's
There is no license model to
yeah.
have a multi-session client on any other hypervisor, even not Windows Server.
Yeah.
It's not in VMware, it's not in Amazon, it's nowhere. You only have servers you can license there.
Yeah. Yeah.
As yeah, how you call it? It's this server license
Hmm.
SPLA. I don't know the
Hmm.
correct name, but in
Hmm.
SPLA there are no clients as far as I know.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah. And also from a cost perspective, that environment could be interesting from a cost perspective still, right? So if you're
Yeah.
looking for alternatives, that might be an interesting one, but we have that in the next slide or
Yeah.
in a couple of slides. So, but there are benefits, but we in the FastTrack team, or you as well, we did projects, we did pilots for evaluating those, and there are some scenarios that speak maybe against Azure Stack HCI,
Yeah, because
right?
we are not marketing. We,
Yeah,
we have
yeah,
to help customers with this.
right, right.
Yeah.
So, we talked about, the networking requirements, the data sovereignty stuff, which would speak in favor for AVD on HCI.
Hmm.
But there might be other factors that speak for it, right? So, for example, if you have large project data that would be expensive to host on Azure, or maybe you don't get the performance for these large project data, or maybe it's a combination of cost and availability, right? And that is maybe done easier on premise, as you already have maybe some local storage there, or as you said, local GPU support. Um, you exactly get the graphics power at at the fabric construction site where you really need it, and don't have to rely on Azure and the resources that are available. And combined with that, RDP short path is an interesting one, which means we have seen that the user is connecting through Azure to get to his desktop, right? But RDP short path is a way of, when this connection is established through Azure, the client and the desktop are sort of exchanging, sort of, where are you? Maybe we can make up a direct connection in order to save bandwidth, and in order to avoid this bypass, right? and do a direct connection and save, latency and get much better connection experience, right? And this is
Especially
also
if the user is on the same place than the Azure Stack HCI cluster. So
right.
if
Yeah,
you are on site and the hardware is also on site, that's a
yeah,
nice one.
yeah. Think of this, if you're working with large monitors and are doing graphics or some construction work that is using GPU, you have to transmit a lot of network packets in order to get a good visuals, right? And they're having a direct connection with small latency is really good. What speaks a little bit against, I would say, is if you have small environments, um, and if the operating costs would be too high, right? Because remember, you need to have own hardware in that environment, right? So maybe Azure Virtual Desktop would be served better from Azure because you don't have hardware costs there. But on-prem, on Azure Stack HCI, you need to take care about the hardware. You need to do the deployment of HCI. You need to have someone that regularly does updates, and there are costs that are involved with that, right? That's for sure. If you have never worked with Azure, it's probably going, you will have at least a steep learning curve, right? But that, I would say, is also including AVD natively on Azure. You need to understand it a little bit if you really want to use it. I think this one is important. If you want to stay disconnected from Azure for a longer period, then HCI is a problem, right? Because HCI needs to talk to Azure from time to time. But for AVD, as said before, every user needs to have a valid Azure connection first to connect to his desktop, right?
Yeah.
And we need to establish those connections through Azure first, right? And if there is a network outage in that time, users may not be able to connect, and that would, not be the service experience that you may want to have, right? So network connectivity in that environment is important. So it might be difficult, if you want to do it on a ship, and and have bad connectivity there, right?
Yeah, then AVD is not for you.
Yeah. Multi-client hosting, right? So, or if you have a host, if you are a service provider, right, and have one piece of hardware that you want to share across customer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, HCI is not intended to be used that way at the moment, right? You can do the hosting model if you have one customer that you serve and you have dedicated hardware for that customer, right? Which you do the service on, that's okay, but not, a shared hosting kind of stuff. That's not the intention of the product. Even if it would be usable, it is, from a technical perspective, you would have a lot of obstacles, and also from a licensing perspective. So don't think of this now. It may change in the future, but not at the moment. Some other difficulties, I think you faced them as well, right? Proxies. It comes with the setup of HCI. It can be done, but it is tricky at some point. Firewalling is also not straightforward. But what is not working with HCI or with Azure Virtual Desktop workloads on top of it, if you do SSL inspection. That means if your proxy server, does the end of the SSL tunnel and inspects and looks into the package, what's inside of this. This won't work because we would see it as some sort of man-in-the-middle attack, and HCI does not, is not allowing to do this, and AVD itself either as well is not allowing this. So
but there are other Microsoft services where that's working, and maybe it will work in the future also with
right.
AVD.
We did have, projects where customers said, "Hey, HCI is a little bit too chatty for me, right? Because I put it in my data center. I'm not used to a hypervisor that talks so much to the internet, right, or to Azure. If this is the case, and if you have problems with that, um, then that would speak against it, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and there are some, not talking a little bit, or maybe a little bit about private link. This is partially implemented, so you can set it up. It's not a nice experience. Some of the, some of the services are working through private link, some not. So you would have to make exclusions with DNS, which is not always nice and easy to set up. So personally, I would, yeah, that's maybe a minus I would give here. If you have such a requirement, then HCI might be a little bit complicated.
Bernhard, let me add something here, because this is, we are doing this series in July, August of 2024. This
Right.
may change in the future. I
Yeah.
already said Azure is fluid. So there are changes. That is always the case with Azure. So maybe some of those points are not valid anymore when you watch
Right.
the series. Maybe there are others then, but these are the things in the moment where you have to think about. And
Yeah.
a general advice is, if you don't trust Microsoft resources, then you can't do AVD, because Microsoft implies that the Azure resources are okay with you. And there are a lot of connections to a lot of Azure things, and even some things outside of Azure. So you have to have trust there. If you said, no, that is too chatty for me, Bernhard, you said it.
Yeah.
Azure HCI, maybe it's not for you, but AVD is not for you. I'm sure of it.
Yeah, and as always, like security, is a very differentiated discussion,
Yeah,
right? So, I mean, you need to trust Microsoft in order for that. I mean, but there is also, a lot of things that we do for HCI when it comes to secure the
yeah,
platform, right? We talked about that earlier before starting that call, right? With 23H2, a lot of the stuff has been done to secure the product, and also AVD. As I told you, from the way of how the setup, like the connection works, it's also having some security benefits there. Right.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And as said, I mean, things may change, so beware that you check if these things that we tell you are still valid, especially when you're watching this quite some time later.
So this means it will be expensive, because you have two pluses there.
Yeah, well, you need to think about
Well,
it, or I leave it up to the audience for making their assumption, but and their conclusion. But let me talk you a little bit through about the licensing. Um, so this piece on the right-hand side is not so much different from Azure Virtual Desktop in Azure, right? Or is it really different? I
I
don't
would say it's the
really.
same. It's the
It's
same
I think the
licensing
same,
you need for an AVD machine
right?
in Azure. The
That
important
means,
part
yeah,
is,
yep,
the user has to have a license if he
mhm,
is connecting to AVD desktop. And
right,
these are the user access rights.
right,
They have to have a
mhm,
VDA
mhm,
license,
right,
in essence. And this the last point on
mhm,
your list is the Windows 11 10 VDA
mhm,
license per user to connect to a virtual
right,
desktop. But you
right,
also to have that if you have a Citrix virtual desktop, or you have a
mhm,
virtual desktop on Horizon. That
mhm,
was the VMware solution. It now
mhm,
has another name, but I don't
mhm,
I don't remember it. But you
mhm.
have to have this license if you connect to a desktop.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, servers, if you are using, the server as VDI desktop, a server operating system, there is also a license model for those, right? But I don't see it that often, therefore I kicked it from that slide deck. But, remember, you don't usually, or the interesting thing is, Windows 11, um, if you would obtain or get a virtual machine with a Windows operating system in Azure, you would usually pay for the operating system as a fee on top of the virtual machine costs, right?
Mhm.
This is not the case with AVD desktops, right? Even with a Windows 11 multi-session image there, you pay basically only the virtual machine price, right? But we, assume that the users that are connecting to these desktops have one of these licenses on the right hand side, right? So it could be a Microsoft 365 E3 license, right? Then the user is eligible to access this desktop, right? I don't have to license the desktop itself. And that's the same for if I would host this Windows 11 multi-session on HCI, right? It's basically the same.
Yeah, let me clarify what you said.
Yeah.
You are talking about the license costs in Azure. So if you say I want a Windows Server VM, it has a different price than a virtual machine with Linux in it. The Linux machine is cheaper. And the same is true for a Windows client. You don't have the additional cost for the operating system, hence Windows Server. It has basically roughly the same price than a virtual machine with a Linux operating system.
Right.
That did you mean? I was thinking on-prem. What is he talking about? And let me add something to the license here. What we need is the last point, the VDA per user license. But Microsoft has included this VDA license in many other bundles. So if you have, for example, Microsoft 365 Business Premium, I'm thinking about this license for me, it includes this VDA license. And as far as I know, it's also including Office. So the rights for Office and an Exchange account. If you look for a cheap or a cost-effective way to get those license and Office, maybe you look at that. Or there are other bundles. Let me call that bundles. It's Office included, it's a virtual machine included, and so on. Yeah. But we need the last point. You can buy that or you can rent that also as a subscription. Only that but most of the customers we're talking to, they have some kind of bundle like Microsoft 365, right? And then you maybe already have this license you need. So no additional costs.
Right.
If you have one of those bundles, there's no additional cost for AVD.
Yeah.
Right.
So these are very common licenses, I would say, right? And you may have them already, right? I would assume that most of the users that look into Azure Virtual Desktop and have some sort of Microsoft products already, that they have a good chance that they already have the VDA license that they need for using AVD on HCI, right?
Okay.
So good. Long story on the right hand side for the stuff, but I think it's was good discussion. Now what comes on top of this? If you are familiar with Azure Stack HCI, then you know that it is a product that reports its usage through Azure, right? So you hook up your Azure Stack HCI to your Azure subscription. Your Azure subscription will know how many physical cores you have in your cluster, right? And we will charge you with $10 per physical core per month. You would see that on your Azure subscription, right? And that's the cost for the, let's say, the Fabric OS, right? The Azure Stack HCI operating system. And then, especially for Azure Virtual Desktop workloads, we charge an extra thing, which is the service fee, with $1 per virtual CPU per hour. That means if you have just one desktop for AVD on your HCI system that has one virtual CPU, right? I think we would come up with sortish $7 per month, or $20.
Right. If you run it 24/7 for 30 days, that would be 720 hours.
Yeah.
multiplied by $1 we have $7.20.
Okay,
If the
maybe
machine
let's.
would have 2 cores, it's
Yeah,
double the price. If it has
right.
4 cores, you got you.
We
I
get
hope
that.
our viewers got it. So depending on
Yeah,
how
well,
many
yeah.
virtual CPUs, yeah,
Mhm,
the
mhm.
machine has,
Right.
not the Azure Stack HCI infrastructure has.
Mhm.
We count, or
Yeah.
Microsoft counts the virtual CPUs of the VMs.
Mhm.
And if you use hyperthreading, you have not every virtual CPU is a real core. A
Yeah.
core has also 2 threads, so you can have 2 threads. Yeah.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
Microsoft is counting the virtual CPUs.
Yeah.
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 If you,
So
like Bernhard would suggest on another slide, maybe shut
yeah.
down your AVD host on the weekend. It's
Ah,
cheaper than 720
you
a month.
you spoiled it. You spoiled it already. Okay, maybe let's do a calculation, right?
Oh, sorry,
Because
Bernhard.
yeah, so to make it a little bit easier, maybe. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's assume we have 160 users we need to serve. Okay, and also let's assume that that these users should get some performance, and there is a recommendation on how would you do the sizing for a user kind of type um, in Azure, right? And as you on the right hand side, you see the virtual machine types in Azure that there are there, and how many users you can get per or should put on or calculate per virtual CPU. So that means if I say 2 users per virtual CPU, that would mean on an 8-core VM, I get 16 users, or I would be allowed
Mhm.
to have 16 users as per this definition, right? It's just an assumption that we have, but I think it's sort of, rule of thumb that should be feasible. Okay, so 16 users per 8-core or virtual CPU based VM, right? So for serving, and then we have obviously we have the hardware itself, right? So I think were talking about one node of your system has 16 cores, right? So the AMD
Exactly. There
16,
is a
six. Okay,
one
okay,
processor machine with 16 cores.
okay. Let's assume that we are serving these 160 users from one cluster, and one cluster is made out of 2 nodes, right?
Mhm.
2 nodes, a 16 physical cores. That means, from a cost perspective, we need to pay $320 per month for this,
Mhm.
just for the HCI OS. And now the AVD section would mean we have the number of VMs times the CPU of each VM times the hours that it runs times the service fee constant, right?
Mhm.
So I would say we have, as said, we have 16 users per 8-core VM or 8 vCPU VM. So we need to have 10 of these VMs, right?
Mhm.
We keep them running 24 by 7, 30 days for the month, right? And then times the service fee, which is a $576. So in total, I would sum it up to almost $900 per month for 160 users, or let's put it different, $5.60 per user per month.
Mhm.
Okay. So
And of course, we didn't include the hardware costs here, but that's
yeah,
yeah, you have to buy the hardware, but
yeah,
there are different models how you
right,
in
yeah,
Germany we call it write it off. So spread your costs over
okay,
years, and
yeah, yeah,
yeah, so
yeah,
we didn't do that, of course.
right,
Yeah, but you
yeah,
don't have to build an Azure data center all for it.
right, right, right. I mean,
So now, is
yes,
there
yeah.
something to save, Bernhard?
Yes, and we talked about that previously, right? So, I
I
mean,
spoiled
if
it,
the
right? Sorry.
yeah, you spoiled it. I mean, if the pricing, the service fee is calculating out, per virtual CPU per hour, as you would do it in Azure, shutting down the VMs when you don't need them in order to save money, the same principle works here as well, which is a little bit odd because if you come from the normal hypervisor environment, you let your virtual machines run 24 by 7, you don't care. But in that environment, you would save. And how much you can save is this calculation, right? So
Yeah.
let's assume that previously we had 10 VMs to serve 160 users. We still have 10 VMs, but we are saying like, let's keep only 2 VMs running 24/7, right? And the other 8 VMs that we have, let's keep them, turn them on only over the work hours. That means from 8 o'clock until, 6 o'clock, something sort of, right?
Yeah, 10 hours
And
a day. Yeah.
Yes, 10 hours a day and maybe only 20 days, only the work days in a month. And yet, multiply that up, and instead of paying almost $900 per month, you're down to $560 per month, or let's say like a 3.52 dollars per users per month, excluding the initial hardware investment costs, right? As you said. But I would say that's sort of still a reasonable, I would say, a reasonable price for such
And this
such
is
an environment.
this is only an example. You may have other requirements. Maybe
Right.
you want to run 4 VMs 24/7 and have 6 VMs for
Right.
scaling up and scaling down. It's just an example how you can see we are
Yeah.
saving here in this example roughly $340 a month. That's a lot of money in a year, and even more over 5 years. But maybe you have other things. And if you don't need your VMs on the weekend at all, it's also possible. Maybe
Yeah.
you can also
Can be.
shut down the Azure Stack HCI cluster if you
Right.
really want to save money,
Yeah.
because I think it's also calculated by day also, the counters. We're not quite sure, but maybe you can save
Yeah.
something there too.
And now I think the next question would be, okay, is that a job that I would need to do manually, or is, the solution helping me sort of doing this automatically? And yes, our Azure Virtual Desktop on HCI is having, tools or mechanisms for allowing you to do so, right? So there are two things, like scaling plans help you to scale up and scale down based on schedules. And there is a Start VM on Connect functionality, where a user that is allowed to reach out to the desktop could actually switch on the virtual machine if it was switched off before. He may need to grab a coffee in order to, compensate the boot time a little bit. But if you educate your users in such kind of environment, you can even save more costs, maybe, right? Okay, so that was it. Hopefully, that was sort of a good calculation. I hope that we didn't, miscalculate on that. If so, let us know. But that's I think reasonable pricing, I would say. Okay. Now, for the people that are new to Azure Virtual Desktop, some basics here. For the ones that are more experienced, you can, jump over this one and go to the next slide. Both solutions are managed through the Azure portal, right? Like AVD natively running on Azure or AVD on HCI is managed through the Azure portal, and there's a specific section in there. Not a big difference from the Azure Virtual Desktop visits, but we will see that when you come to then the demo where the differences are. So some artifacts that I need to explain is what is an AVD session host. This is the VDI. This is the desktop, right? This is a virtual machine which is running either a single or multi-session operating system, Windows 11 currently, right, with some agents on top of it, which hook them up to Azure Virtual Desktop, to the Azure Virtual Desktop service, right? And it also contains the applications that you want to give your users, or that your users are working with, right? They are available in two sort of usages, right? So you can have a dedicated desktop. That means this desktop is owned by me. Nobody else is allowed to log on to this one. Or you can have a shared desktop. That means, well, Bernhard Frank, may be logging on to AVD number 1 today and maybe to AVD 2 tomorrow, because load balancer decides I should be shifted around, right? So there is some sort of shared model as well. How is that controlled? There is an AVD host pool, which defines how the desktops should be tanked, which means what operating system should go onto these desktops, what is the size of the desktop, what can the people do with it, right? So are USB devices allowed to put through to the desktops, or do I want to block this, for example, right? And I also control here if this is a personal desktop or a pooled desktop. This is a setting of the AVD host pool. So basically, it's a configurational thing. Okay. Then you do have an application group. This is also an object that you define in Azure, and basically it's a collection of applications. That means you either say Bernhard Frank is allowed to use Word on that host pool, or Bernhard Frank is allowed to see the desktop and grab the desktop. So it is basically what a user can do in AVD. And then you have the workspace, which is a collection of these application groups that I was explaining previously, right? So it's building up the view for the user, because I may not only have rights to one application group, I may have multiple ones. And in order to see that in a sort of a workspace, visualized for me when I'm logging on to AVD, right? Then I need a workspace for collecting all these application groups. And the last thing that I want to mention out here, which I think is pretty important, is the scaling plan, which is a definition that you can make in Azure, where you tell which or how many session hosts need to boot up at what time, and how the scaling and upscaling and downscaling of these session hosts basically work. And that is done on demand. So it looks basically up how many users are currently connecting, and based on that demand, it will scale automatically up and down to save money. Okay. Questions, Carsten? Hope I got it right. Or any additions to that?
No.
Okay.
Perfect. Let's go on.
Let's talk a little bit about the prerequisites. One we have seen already a little bit. You in one of the early slides, which is you have to have a classic Active Directory that is synced to your Entra ID, right? You don't need to sync everything, right? You can limit, it down to a organizational unit or to some organizational units that you want to sync, but you need to have some users that live on-prem and also in your Entra ID, right? Azure registered. You need to have an Azure registered HCI cluster. Okay, I think that's obvious. It also needs to be 23H2 or greater. You need to have a stable network connection with Azure, otherwise a user wouldn't be able to connect. We talked about that. And you need to have at least one operating system available on that cluster that you can use for your session hosts, right? I mean, you want to put an operating system inside of it, right? And that can be a Windows 11 multi-session, for example, or even a Windows Server operating system. Not so common, but you could do it. And as these desktops need to talk to the outside world, you need to have some network connectivity configured, right? We call it a logical network, but we'll see that in a later demo what we mean with that, right? But for you, I mean, the virtual machines need to talk to the outside world, to the internet, in order to make that connection possible. One other thing which is pretty obvious, I mean, you need to store a virtual hard disk for that desktop, right? And there is a storage path that you need to do. Storage path is a definition for a cluster shared volume in failover cluster speech, if you will. That's just that's the place where the virtual hard disk goes, which needs to be there. Yeah, and then we definitely need to have the desktops. So we need to provision those. And there will be some software that is required for that solution to work. We need, for example, to have the Azure Connected Machine Agent to be installed. That means the desktop is visible as virtual machine in Azure. Then we have the Azure Monitoring Agent installed. It's not 100% well, I would say it's not required for the solution to work, right? But I would highly recommend, and I think we do it by default, the installation of the Azure Monitoring Agent in order to get lifetime data of that virtual machine, right? Because you may want to see, hey, is this desktop healthy or not? Right, and therefore we need the Azure Monitoring Agent. And then the third point is the RD agent, or the agent bootloader and the remote desktop agent loader, which they hook up these desktops to AVD, and they are also the most important part for making this scenario able to work. So quite some agents on every desktop that need to be installed, but be sure you don't have to do it manually. This will be installed through Azure automatically on the desktops. Um, yeah, and this is, I think, the last slide. I think we in this presentation. I mean, we are apologies for the long video, but it's containing everything, or not everything, but the most important facts as we think. There are some limitations as per this date of when we did the video. So they might be no longer valid. So please check for those. Currently, you need to have your session host to be domain joined. Right. In our case, that would be the powercourse.net domain, right? That's our domain. There is no Entra ID only join at the moment. That may change, but at the moment, it's a classic Active Directory domain join scenario that is supported. What you should not do is mix session hosts in Azure and Azure Stack HCI in the same host pool, right? So you can have different host pools, right? The ones that serve desktops from Azure and the ones that serving desktops from Azure Stack HCI, but they shouldn't be mixed together, right? So don't have, one host pool serving desktops at the same time from Azure and from Azure Stack HCI. Why? Even if you would be able to do it technically, I don't think it is a good idea, because the user would probably get different performance and latency experience, right? So he connects on ones that are connected locally or to Azure Stack HCI locally would be, maybe faster or slower, so troubleshooting wise, it would be not the ideal approach. So I wouldn't do it. Yes, and the other two, I think they are very uncommon, therefore in small. So Azure Automation was used in the past for scaling session hosts, but that is a couple of years maybe ago now. So I wouldn't do it either. So if you have been using AVD before and were using Azure Automation, that can't be done at the moment with Azure Stack HCI, or the same principle, or you may need to re-edit the code. I would just recommend to use scaling plans which work. And the other thing which is also not there is a per user based access pricing. This is also a licensing method that is available in Azure or for AVD natively in Azure, right? That's something that you could do. However, it's not so common to change that that pricing to a per user based pricing, and that's also not supported at the moment for AVD on Azure Stack HCI. Okay, but I don't think that it is being used that often. Okay, That would be it from my side. Carsten, do you have anything to add? I think because
No, I'm
that's, I
fine.
think,
We covered a lot.
mhm.
So now we go into the doing, right?
Yes. So in the next video, we are, I think, yes, we are doing a simple deployment. We are kicking off the um, AVD desktops and show you how the user experience would look like.
Yeah. Okay. See you in the next one.